Your sister finally has stability, my mom said as she passed the gravy. When will you grow up? I just looked at her and said, probably around the time I bought my third property. Her jaw dropped, so did her fork. Your sister finally has stability, my mom said with that smug little smile she wears like perfume, overpowering, artificial, and guaranteed to linger in a room long after she's gone. She passed the gravy boat with the elegance of a queen bestowing a royal decree, then locked eyes with me like she was daring me to react, to bite back, to ruin the evening, the illusion, the sacred sanctity of yet another Bennett family Thanksgiving. I didn't speak right away. I didn't flinch. I let the words hang in the air, marinating in the silence like the dry turkey she overcooked for the 5th year in a row. My fork paused midair, my lips curled into the faintest smile, and I met her gaze with all the calm I'd spent years teaching myself to wear like armor. When will you grow up? She added, now with more venom, like a snake getting tired of waiting to strike. And that's when I said it, probably around the time I bought my third property. The sound of her fork hitting the china was louder than I expected. She blinked like I'd slapped her. My dad coughed. Maya, my little sister, the shining star, the chosen one, choked on her green bean casserole. No one spoke for a full 10 seconds. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, where every unsaid word in the room becomes a ghost. But here's the thing most people don't understand about a moment like that. It's never really about what you said. It's about what you didn't say for the last 20 years. That one line was just the grenade. Everything underneath it, that was the damn war. I was never the favorite. Not even close. Hell, I'm not sure I ever broke the top 3 in a family of 4. Maya could have crashed her car into the garage again, and my mom would have somehow blamed the builder. I could have gotten promoted, published, proposed to, and still only gotten a raised eyebrow and a polite nice. The running joke growing up was that I was the difficult one, the one who always had to be different. They said it like it was a defect, like being independent was some kind of social disease I refused to vaccinate against. Maya, on the other hand, she was the comeback kid. She could fail upward in a vacuum. Fired from 3 jobs in 2 years? She's finding herself. Caught cheating on her boyfriend? She's under pressure. Blew through our parents' emergency fund on crypto? She was trying to invest. But me? God forbid I didn't call one weekend. Suddenly, I was selfish, ungrateful, the disappointment. And I took it. For a long time, I took it. I played along. I smiled at the dinner table, sent the Christmas cards, listened to the lectures about career stability and marriage, and when I planned to settle down, as if they'd ever seen me clearly enough to notice I was building something that none of them would even begin to understand. So when I dropped that line about the third property, it wasn't just to shock them. It was to mark the end of a very long, very quiet chapter, because they weren't going to write my story for me anymore. I had the pen. Now, the weirdest part, I didn't even plan to say it. I'd rehearsed other things, more polite, more passive. But something about that gravy boat crossing the table like a peace offering from a queen to her peasant just snapped something in me. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. Pure, unshakable clarity. I realized in that moment that I didn't care if they were proud of me. I didn't need their approval, because they weren't even in the same world as me anymore. Maya finally broke the silence. Wait, third property? You bought a house? Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence like her ego had stubbed its toe. No, I said calmly. I bought a duplex last year. Before that, a condo in Atlanta. The first one was a fixer-upper in Kansas City. I've been busy, growing up. And there it was, the shift. The moment they all looked at me, not like the screw-up or the spinster or the oddball, but like someone they didn't know. Because they didn't. They never had. Not really. My mom tried to recover. Bless her narcissistic heart. Well, that's impressive, I guess. You didn't tell us. You didn't ask, I replied, taking a sip of my wine like it was just another Thursday night. You were too busy congratulating Maya on signing her lease. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, like a warrior standing on a battlefield of burned expectations. But mostly I just felt tired. Tired of pretending I hadn't outgrown all of them years ago. Tired of pretending their opinions still held any weight. Tired of biting my tongue so hard I tasted iron every holiday. Thanksgiving for most families is about gratitude and warmth and overeating and hugging your weird uncle goodbye. For mine, it was always about optics, about keeping up appearances, making sure everyone believed the Bennetts were normal, decent suburban stock. But this year, I decided to flip the table. Metaphorically, of course. The real one was solid oak and way too expensive to make a point that dramatic. As the conversation sputtered into awkward territory, Maya asking if I was some kind of landlord now, my mom pretending she knew what equity meant, I just sat back and watched. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't at the kids' table anymore. I owned the damn dining room. But what they didn't know, what I hadn't said yet, was that this was just step one. The real revenge wasn't the properties. It wasn't the condo or the cash flow or the freedom. It was the silence I'd weaponized over the years, the information I'd gathered, the patience I'd honed. See, while they were busy dismissing me, I was planning. And I'd only just begun. I think most people assume revenge is loud, shouting matches, slammed doors, maybe even a drink thrown in someone's face if you really want to lean into the drama. But the truth is, the most satisfying kind of revenge is quiet, slow, and so carefully planned that by the time your target realizes what's happening, they're already drowning in it, and you're just watching from the shore with dry feet and clean hands. That's what I had done. Not out of spite, exactly, but out of necessity. Because when you grow up being constantly underestimated, constantly patronized, and constantly measured against someone who's been failing upward since puberty, you either give in and accept your role in the family narrative, or you build your own damn story from scratch, chapter by chapter, and make sure it ends in such a way that not a single one of them can claim they saw it coming. After I dropped the third property line at Thanksgiving, I didn't clarify. I let them stew in it. That silence, the one where they all stared at me like I just revealed I was moonlighting as a CIA agent, was worth more than any forced compliment they could have given me in the past decade. And the irony? The punchline? The real secret? My precious golden girl sister, the one they toasted that evening for finally getting her life together, the one they said had found stability after so many years of struggle, was living in a unit I owned, paying rent to me through a property management company I had carefully structured to keep my name out of every document and interaction. Her stability was quite literally built on my foundation. Of course, she didn't know that. Nobody did. And that wasn't by accident. 3 years ago, I'd hit what people like to call a breaking point, although to me it felt more like a doorway. I had just walked away from my 5th marketing job in 7 years. Not because I wasn't good at what I did, I was, but because I'd grown exhausted of pretending I was fulfilled by helping mediocre companies sell mediocre products to consumers who didn't need them. I had savings. Not a fortune, but enough to breathe. And I used that breath to take a hard look at what I actually wanted my life to feel like, not look like. And when I stripped away all the expectations, all the noise, all the guilt I'd been carrying about not having a husband or a mortgage or a LinkedIn page littered with buzzwords and fake praise, I realized I didn't want a job. I wanted leverage. And so, after watching a few too many late-night videos about passive income and real estate flips, most of which I didn't believe, but some of which sparked a curiosity I couldn't ignore, I flew to Kansas City, a place where no one knew me, where the housing market wasn't yet drunk on itself, and I bought a rundown duplex using a combination of my savings and a small inheritance from Grandma Jean, the only person in our family who ever looked at me like I was more than an inconvenience. The property needed work, a lot of it, but I found a retired contractor named Walt who took me under his wing, mostly because I asked the kind of questions that showed I was serious. And together we turned that sad, neglected structure into something solid, beautiful, and most importantly, profitable. The first tenant moved in 6 months later. Then I refinanced, used the equity to buy a condo in Atlanta, this time sight unseen, and after that, a third property, Maya's condo. That one I held onto for a while, watching from a distance as she spiraled through job after job, breakup after breakup, always landing on her feet, thanks to our mother's ever-present safety net and my father's gentle indifference. I never reached out. I never rubbed it in. But when the call came one afternoon, my mom's voice trembling with that unique blend of martyrdom and subtle blame, telling me that Maya had been evicted from yet another apartment and needed help finding something affordable but decent, I knew the time had come to test just how deep their assumptions about me really ran. I told her I had a friend who owned a few places and might be willing to cut her a deal if Maya could be responsible with rent. She was grateful, of course, overly so, thanking me as though I'd thrown myself in front of traffic. Maya barely acknowledged it, just gave a half-hearted, thanks, I guess, which in Maya speak was practically effusive gratitude. I passed her information to my management company. They drew up a lease, and within 2 weeks she was moving into a 1-bedroom condo in a decent neighborhood, one she bragged about to anyone who would listen, proudly declaring that she was finally adulting properly and had found the perfect place through a friend's connection. And all the while, each rent payment she made, late more often than not, went directly to me. The sister she believed still worked part-time doing freelance writing or whatever it is you do. She had no idea. Neither did our parents. And honestly, that was the best part. Because if you'd seen their faces at that dinner, if you'd felt the shift in the air after I said those words, you'd understand why I never once felt guilty. Not when she moved in, not when she defaulted the first time, and definitely not when she called me weeks later, oblivious to who she was really speaking to ask for an extension on rent because she'd been between gigs again and things were tight right now. I gave her the extension, of course. I even waived the late fee. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was just waiting. And here's the thing about waiting. When you're the one holding the cards, every second is power. Every delay, every deferment, every carefully delayed reveal is a tool in your hand. They all thought I was drifting, that I hadn't grown up, that I was somehow behind because I didn't parade my life in front of them like a holiday centerpiece. But what they failed to understand, what they still didn't understand, was that stability isn't about appearances. It's not about making just enough to cover the bills or finally renting a clean apartment. It's about control. And I had it. Quietly, completely. And yet, I wasn't done. Because while it felt good to finally plant that little truth bomb in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, I had something much bigger planned, something that would shake the table a lot harder than a passive-aggressive comment and a dropped fork. Let's just say the rent was only the beginning. There's a certain kind of satisfaction that comes not from revenge itself, but from watching a lie unfold precisely the way you planned it. From watching someone walk confidently into a trap you designed down to the last screw and thread, convinced they're the one in control when in reality they've never even held the map. That was exactly what I felt the day Maya signed the lease to the condo, my condo, believing she was catching a lucky break from some anonymous property owner who just happened to be a friend of her sister, and that she, as always, was being rescued by the grace of someone else's generosity. The tragic comedy of it all was that the safety net she thought was beneath her was really a web, and I had spun it with the patience of a woman who'd been ignored for decades and finally decided that invisibility had its advantages. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, laptop open, lease template pulled up, fingers poised on the keyboard while I debated how far I was willing to go, how tightly I wanted to pull the strings. The property itself had been sitting vacant for a few months, not because I couldn't find a tenant, I could have listed it and had someone in there within the week, but because I was waiting for the right moment. I had a feeling that sooner or later Maya would stumble again. And when she did, I wanted to be ready. And so I formed a holding company. Nothing flashy, just an LLC with a generic name and a P.O. box in another city, routed the ownership through a management firm I'd already used on my other properties, and ensured that every interaction she would have, from the first call to the signed lease, would be handled by someone else. No mention of me. No trace. She signed the lease without reading most of it. I knew she wouldn't. Maya's never been one for details. She walked through the unit, nodded at the granite countertops and the freshly painted walls, made a comment about the natural light being perfect for her morning yoga routine, and chatted with the agent like they were old friends discussing vacation plans. She was excited about it, told our parents later that she was finally stepping into her power, that the universe was aligning for her, that this time everything was falling into place. I listened to all of it over dinner a few weeks later, pretending to be surprised, pretending to be impressed, nodding at all the right places while sipping my wine and silently noting how effortlessly she continued to narrate her life like a spiritual journey, even though the only thing she'd truly manifested was someone else's generosity. Again. But the beauty of the trap wasn't in its setup. It was in the details that would unfold slowly, piece by piece, until the moment she realized the truth. For starters, the rent wasn't cheap. It wasn't astronomical either, just enough to make her sweat when she was between gigs, which, knowing Maya, was going to happen sooner rather than later. I'd built in late fees, clauses about missed payments, and a quiet little note that if the lease was broken early, she'd be responsible for 2 months' rent as penalty. Nothing illegal, nothing even particularly harsh, just standard procedure dressed up in fine print designed not to punish, but to apply pressure. And pressure, when applied correctly and consistently, always reveals what's beneath the surface. 3 months in, the late payment started. First, it was just a few days, then a week, then 2. The management company sent notices, reminders, friendly emails with subject lines like just a nudge and rent due reminder. She replied once, said she'd had a delay in her freelance payments and was waiting for a client to process her invoice. It wasn't processed. Another month passed. Another notice. I watched the dashboard on my owner's portal, tracking every missed payment. Every day she let the balance sit untouched. And I'll be honest, it didn't feel like victory. Not in the way I thought it might. It felt clinical, distant, like watching someone slowly fail a test they didn't know they were taking. And yet, I couldn't look away. I began to wonder if she even considered where the money went when she paid rent. If she pictured some faceless corporate entity, some nameless landlord who sat in an office counting bills while she scraped together what she could to hold on to a little square of independence. Did she feel ashamed? Resentful? Or did she still think she was winning? That she'd manifested this perfect space, that this place was proof the universe was finally supporting her journey? The truth was, the condo was just the bait. The real trap, the part I hadn't fully decided whether or not to spring, was what I could do with the information I now had. Not just about her financial patterns, but about the way she moved through the world, the way she treated responsibilities when she thought no one was watching. I had access to everything. Her rental history, her excuses, her emails, even the phone calls she made to the management line when she was trying to charm her way into another extension. She didn't recognize my voice on the recordings. Of course she wouldn't. That was the point. At one point, I considered sending her a notice of eviction. Not because I wanted to kick her out, but because I wanted to see what she would do, how she would spin it. Whether she would come crawling to our parents again, or if she'd try to stand on her own for once in her life. But I held back. Not because I was softening, but because the story wasn't finished yet. I needed it to reach the right pitch, the right level of pressure, before I let anything fall. What none of them knew, what I hadn't even begun to hint at, was that the condo wasn't the only thread I was holding. I had been pulling others, quietly, patiently, waiting for the day when everything I'd collected, everything I'd built in the background, would converge in a single, undeniable moment. I didn't want revenge that screamed. I wanted revenge that echoed. And the echo was coming. Because just as Maya began to fumble her way through yet another failed attempt at stability, I had found something else. Something that changed the shape of everything that came before. It started with a letter. A letter my mother never intended me to see. But that part of the story, that's going to take a bit of unpacking. There are moments in life so quiet, so seemingly uneventful on the surface, that you don't even realize the ground has shifted until long after the dust has settled, and all that's left is the unsettling knowledge that everything you believed about the people you came from might have been carefully staged illusions, choreographed distractions built to keep you from seeing the truth buried just beneath the polished floorboards of your own memory. One such moment came in the form of a cream-colored envelope tucked between two pieces of junk mail, addressed in that delicate, looping cursive I hadn't seen since the last Christmas card my grandmother ever sent me. The return address was hers, though she'd already been gone nearly 6 months. And when I saw it, I didn't feel grief, not immediately, but something colder, heavier. Like suspicion sharpened by years of instinct telling me I was always a few steps behind the curtain everyone else in the family had access to without question. It wasn't until I opened the envelope and pulled out the neatly folded letter that I realized I had been holding my breath, as if my body had sensed before my mind did that this wasn't just a belated keepsake or forgotten farewell. This was a secret someone didn't want me to know. The letter, written in my grandmother's hand, was dated 2 weeks before her death. And while the tone was warm, familiar, full of that quiet love only she ever showed me without strings, the content made my stomach tighten in a way I hadn't felt since I was a teenager, sitting in the back seat of the car while my mother lectured me for wearing too much eyeliner and trying too hard to get the wrong kind of attention. My grandmother had left me something, not just sentimentally, but legally and deliberately. In addition to the modest sum I'd already received, she'd also arranged for the transfer of a small property she had inherited from her own sister years ago, a rundown single-family house in a town no one in our family ever talked about, which made sense once I read the part about how she had intended to give it to me directly, without interference, because she knew I would know what to do with it. She said I was resourceful, that I paid attention to things people missed, that I understood value beyond appearances. I read that sentence 3 times, blinking back something I couldn't name, because no one, not a teacher, not a friend, not even a therapist, had ever put it quite like that before. She saw me. She always had. But then came the part that made my hands tremble. She had sent the letter and the deed to my mother, asking her to pass it along once the dust had settled, believing naively, it turned out, that my mother would honor her wishes without complication. But of course, that never happened. No one had ever mentioned the house. No one had even hinted at it. And if not for a clerical oversight, a delayed forwarding address, and a particularly lazy mail carrier, I may never have known that it existed at all. The betrayal wasn't surprising. Not entirely. My mother's ability to rewrite the truth in real time was practically Olympic level, and she'd spent most of her life sanding down the inconvenient edges of any story that didn't support the image she wanted to project. But the fact that she had withheld something my grandmother had explicitly left for me, not out of necessity or financial constraint, but out of sheer control, because she couldn't stand the idea of me having something she hadn't approved, something she hadn't orchestrated, something I hadn't earned by dancing to her tune, that was the part that lit a fire in my gut that no amount of property or passive income could extinguish. I didn't confront her right away. I wanted to. Every bone in my body screamed to pick up the phone, to drive over, to demand answers with a kind of righteous fury that would shake the very walls of her overdecorated, emotionally sterile home. But instead, I did what I had learned to do in the years since I left that house. I waited. I researched. I pulled property records, searched through county clerk databases, pieced together timelines, and discovered that not only had she failed to transfer the deed, she had also quietly filed for custodial rights over the property under the guise of handling estate matters, effectively claiming it was unallocated and absorbing it into the larger estate, which, of course, she managed. It was theft, really, but dressed in the paperwork of someone who'd done it before and expected no one to look closely. But I looked. And when I was done looking, I made a plan. I contacted a real estate attorney, explained the situation in detail, provided the letter as evidence, and within 2 weeks I had not only reclaimed the property in my name, but also discovered that my mother had been drawing a small amount of rental income from it over the past few years, leasing it out through a third party and keeping it entirely off the books, or so she thought. The amount wasn't huge, not enough to get the IRS interested unless someone pointed it out, but it was enough to prove motive. Enough to expose the truth. Still, I didn't tell her what I'd done. Not yet. I wanted to time it right. See, there's a difference between setting a trap and knowing when to spring it. And this one, I realized, was part of something larger than just my mother's betrayal. It was the missing piece that made the rest of my plan not only possible, but poetic. Because now, not only was Maya living in a condo I owned, blissfully unaware that every dollar she scraped together for rent was landing in my account, but my mother, the same woman who once told me I was practically unemployable and would probably end up one of those bitter women with cats and unpaid bills, was unknowingly relying on rental income from a property she no longer legally owned. And the best part? That income had just stopped. When the tenants didn't receive their usual maintenance checks or lease renewal paperwork, they reached out to me, their new landlord, and I explained the situation clearly, professionally, and with just enough restraint to keep from gloating. I told them they were welcome to stay, that the terms would remain the same for now, but that all payments were to be rerouted through my firm. They were relieved, polite, oblivious to the storm I was preparing just behind the scenes. I began drafting a letter addressed not to my mother, but to the accountant she used to prepare her taxes, explaining the discrepancy in rental income and property ownership, attaching the corrected title and date of transfer, and letting the facts do the talking. I didn't send it yet, but I had it ready. And as I stared at that letter, as I thought about the years she spent gaslighting me into believing I was the unstable one, the unpredictable one, the one who needed to get it together, I realized that my revenge was no longer about proving her wrong. It was about dismantling, piece by piece, the mythology she built around herself. Not with anger, not with accusations, but with the kind of methodical, undeniable truth that couldn't be ignored, even by someone who had spent a lifetime editing reality to suit her reflection. She had taken something from me, tried to, anyway, and now I had taken it back. And I wasn't nearly finished. There's a peculiar stillness that settles in just before a confrontation you've spent years preparing for. A kind of anticipatory silence that doesn't feel like peace, exactly, but rather like the moment when the final piece of a long, complicated puzzle finally clicks into place and you're able to take a full step back and see the entire picture for what it always was, not what you hoped it would be, not what people insisted it was, but what it truly became through years of denial, manipulation, avoidance, and small, cutting choices that were disguised as love. That was how I felt as I stood in the doorway of my parents' dining room the week after Thanksgiving, holding a thick manila folder in one hand and a bottle of Chardonnay in the other. Not because I planned to drink it, but because I knew my mother would find it impossible to relax if I brought wine to her table without asking. She was setting the table, of course she was, adjusting the silverware with surgical precision, probably more for the aesthetic than the guests, since she had always believed a flawless presentation could cover the rot underneath. Maya was already seated, hunched over her phone, typing something with the kind of laser focus that suggested it was either Instagram or a desperate response to a late payment notice. My father, as expected, was in his usual chair, sipping lukewarm coffee and reading the same section of the paper he'd probably already read that morning, tuning everything out like he'd learned to do sometime in the early 80s and never quite managed to unlearn. I placed the wine on the counter with a quiet clink, ignored my mother's thin-lipped glance of disapproval, and took a seat across from Maya, who looked up just long enough to offer a distracted wave before returning to whatever minor crisis lived on her screen. It was almost funny how little she seemed to notice me now, like she had subconsciously reverted back to the belief that I was just another background figure in her world, another passive presence who existed solely to witness her endless string of reinventions and fresh starts. But that illusion was about to end, and I wanted to make sure I remembered every second of it. I brought something, I said finally, breaking the silence, my voice steady but not sharp, because I didn't want this to be a scream. I wanted it to be a mirror, held up with cold clarity and zero apology. My mother paused, knife in hand, then turned slowly to face me, narrowing her eyes in that theatrical way she did whenever she sensed she wasn't in control of the narrative. "What is it?" she asked flatly, already suspicious. I placed the folder on the table and slid it across the polished wood like a dealer laying down a royal flush, then leaned back and folded my hands in my lap, waiting, not for their gratitude, but for their confusion to bloom into recognition. Inside were the deeds to all 3 properties, marked clearly, legally, and undeniably under my name, the LLC documents, the contracts with the management firms, and most importantly, the transfer documents from the house my grandmother had left me, along with copies of the original letter she had sent, complete with her signature and the dated postmark that proved my mother had sat on it for months after her death before discarding it like an inconvenient receipt. Maya reached for the folder first, flipping through the contents with a kind of lazy curiosity until she landed on the lease agreement bearing her own signature and the rent schedule that clearly identified my holding company as her landlord. I watched her eyebrows inch higher with every page, watched her mouth fall open slightly as she realized that the friend who had helped her secure the condo during her last emotional meltdown wasn't a friend at all, but me, her sister, the one she hadn't thanked, hadn't called, hadn't even thought about except to maybe mention in passing how she was still figuring things out. My mother stayed quiet longer, her eyes scanning the documents as if searching for a loophole, a mistake, a typo she could seize upon to unravel the entire truth. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, tight, like a thread about to snap. "Why would you hide this from us?" she asked, not with hurt, but with offense, as if the real betrayal was not her lies, but my refusal to give her the satisfaction of participating in my success. I didn't answer her right away. I turned to Maya instead. "You're 3 months behind on rent," I said evenly. "And yes, you've been paying me. Or trying to." She blinked, opened her mouth, closed it again, and then, like a woman choosing to sprint from a burning building rather than try to put out the fire, she pushed back from the table and stormed out of the room, muttering something about toxic energy and manipulation that made no sense to anyone, least of all to her. My father glanced up from his paper, looked at me, looked at the folder, and then looked away again, cowardice in a sweater vest. But my mother, to her credit, didn't leave. She stood there, shoulders square, eyes locked on mine, and asked, "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this little stunt?" And that was when I understood something that changed the entire temperature of the room, the story, and maybe even my place in it. I wasn't doing this for revenge anymore. I wasn't doing this to hurt her or to teach Maya a lesson or even to reclaim the things that had been taken from me in 1,000 small, silent ways. I was doing it to break the story. The story they had written about me, the one where I was the unstable one, the underachiever, the spinster daughter who didn't quite fit, didn't quite succeed, didn't quite live the way she was supposed to. And I had broken it. With paperwork. With silence. With time. "I'm not hoping to accomplish anything," I said quietly. "I already have." I stood, picked up the folder, and began walking toward the door. Not because I expected applause or closure, but because I knew staying any longer would only invite more of the same cycles: blame, denial, dismissal. And I wasn't interested in playing those roles anymore. But just before I reached the door, I turned back and said the one thing I hadn't planned on, the one thing that came not from strategy or spite, but from a sudden and strange pang of honesty. "You always wanted me to act like family," I said, pausing just long enough for the weight of it to land. "Well, I just did what family does. I took care of you, even if it meant watching you squirm. And then I left." Later that night, as I sat on my porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and the cold creeping in through the cracks, I opened the mail that had been sitting on my kitchen table all week. Among the bills and flyers was a thin envelope from the IRS, addressed to my holding company, with language that was polite, neutral, and unmistakably serious. Someone had reported a discrepancy. There was no sender listed, but I didn't need one. I already knew. I leaned back, let out a long, quiet breath, and smiled.